time flies when you're having fun, right? Time flies when you're having fun. And I hope that you've been having fun in this journey together. I'm having fun, and I'm super excited to have some more fun as we kick off our new series this first week of March called The Salty Life, right? I'm all about it, super excited about The Salty Life. In fact, I didn't even know this, but as I was working on titling this series and stuff, I was like, The Salty Life, that really makes sense. I think we can do that. And the other day I was driving, and I pulled up behind this truck, and I looked on the back of it, and there was like this decal that said, The Salt Life, right? So I hope we don't get in trouble for plagiarism or anything, because I didn't even have that in mind. Totally came up with this thing on my own. But I think we're okay because we added a Y. All right, I think we're okay. But I'm so excited about this series because the whole focus is to equip us and empower us to take the next step in having spiritual conversations with people around us. People in our lives, people that we come into contact, especially as we prepare for our Community Impact event on March 14th and our Easter Sunday celebration. Now, guys, if you're like me, all right, sometimes one of the most difficult barriers to having the conversation is actually starting the conversation, right? How do we get there? How do we talk to people about Jesus? And we've actually developed all kinds of different tools in past years for like entering into this conversation, for beginning it. Just question random. Has anyone ever owned or wore a WWJD bracelet? You remember those? Right? We've had those. Has anybody ever like made a necklace like out of like beads, and like each bead represents a different process in God's salvation story and plan? Anybody ever done those before? I've done some of those, right? And then sometimes they have these little things called tracts. I don't know if you've ever seen a tract, but they're a little booklet that asks a question like, is there life after death, right? And then you open it up and they talk about Jesus, they talk about the Bible, or they'll say like, who is Jesus on the front? And you open it up and you start to understand why, and they'll take you through something called the plan of salvation, right? Some of them, they even disguise like ridiculous amounts of money, right? There's like $1 million bill laying on the ground, right? And you reach down and you're like, oh, sweet, I'm at bank. And you pick it up and you're like, oh, it's only Jesus, right? And you feel like you've been tricked into the gospel. Right? And I'm not saying that those things haven't been effective or they haven't worked. I'm just thinking there's got to be a better way, right? There's got to be a better way to start this conversation. Maybe there's a better method than, hey, if you die today, do you know where you'd go? And like Jimmy looks over and he's like, dude, I was talking about the game on Friday. And it's just like there's this like awkwardness about sharing our faith. So instead of using these kinds of methods that tend to be more passive or awkward and really cause us to be intimidated to share the hope of Jesus with others, let me share with you a method that I've learned to be effective, developed by Dr. Rice Brooks. It's called the SALT method, SALT. And there's even an app for it, right? Because there's an app for everything. So if you go on the App Store and look up the God Test, you will find this app, and there's like little YouTube videos that you can watch that actually show you how to use this method. If you don't have a smartphone, you can go to www.thegodtest.org and find out more there. But SALT is simply an acronym for start a conversation, ask questions, listen, and tell your story. Okay? Super easy to remember, super easy to use. So that's where we're going today. We're going to learn how to have spiritual conversations with people that's easy to remember and everyone can do. And if we look at John chapter 4, we kind of see how this whole process begins with a conversation that Jesus begins in this setting with a Samaritan woman in a well. All right, so we're going to talk about how to start a conversation. Remember, the S stands for start the conversation in the SALT method, and Jesus shows us how in John chapter 4. Turn there with me, or we'll put it up on the screen. Your choice. But when we read in this historic account of John, this is what we read. Chapter 4. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Although, in fact, it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now, he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was, sat down from the journey. Sat down by a well. It was about noon when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy some food. Now, we're going to stop right there, keeping in mind that there are 3 steps after this initial step of starting the conversation. So don't make the mistake of thinking what we're talking about this morning is the be-all, end-all. It's just the first step. But like we said a little bit ago, it's often the hardest step. Okay, but looking at the text, I want to point something out that's really crucial to what we just read in verse 4. John writes, interestingly enough, this is what he says. Now he, Jesus, had to go through Samaria. And I'll tell you why that's such a remarkable phrase. And it's because he didn't have to go through Samaria. He didn't have to go through Samaria. It says he had to go through Samaria, but he didn't have to, right? In fact, historically, when Jews such as Jesus were going from Judea to Galilee, they did not travel the northern route through Samaria, and they did that for a number of reasons. First being, although it was faster and easier, it was through the mountains, where there were certain people of whom the Jews had bad history with, right? They had tried to drive them out of their land, right? And they didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay. And there was just this conflict and fighting that had been going on. So that was kind of awkward. But then secondly was the animosity that existed between Jews and Samaritans, right? They had different ideas about the way things were supposed to be. For instance, Samaritans believed that God's chosen place of worship was on Mount Gerizim, where Abraham had first built an altar. While the Jews believed that the right place of worship was selected by King David, where his Solomon had built the temple. Both agreed God wanted one defined place of worship, but they both disagreed where. And so this was a conflict. Samaritans also rejected portions of the Old Testament books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the prophets and Psalms, because of their focus on Jerusalem being God's chosen place of worship. And so there's this thing going on between them to the point where they don't like each other, right? They're not getting along. You ever have that problem? You ever run into somebody you don't like? Yeah, I've done that, right? And it was to the point where they didn't even talk to each other, to the point where when they were traveling between locations, they would intentionally take a different route so they didn't have to encounter one another. So no, Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. He didn't. But he had to go through Samaria, because Samaria was included in the land of darkness that needed a great light, as recorded by the prophet Isaiah. The people of Samaria needed to hear that God loved them too, that God cared about them. And his plan was to draw all people to himself, including them, so that everyone could experience the fullness and abundance of life and freedom that comes from knowing him. Jesus didn't have to go through Samaria. He chose to go through Samaria. He had to go because people there needed to know him. And again, knowing him is life. Knowing Jesus is life. So no, he didn't have to go. He wanted to. And really, that's the first step to starting a conversation. The first step to the SALT method. To start the conversation, we have to want to start the conversation. We have to desire to start the conversation. Recently, I attended an evangelism summit on the campus of Southern Wesleyan University. Anybody here from Southern Wesleyan University? Yeah, I was at your campus for this evangelism event, and it actually reminded me of a class that I took at Kingswood University years ago. It was a personal evangelism class, how to talk to people about Jesus. And the assignment in the class that we had to do in order to pass this class, well, we had to talk to 5 different people who didn't know Jesus or believe or follow him, and we had to share our faith. 5 different people. That was what we had to do in order to pass the class. And then we had to write a paper on each encounter and what we experienced and how it went and how it didn't go, that kind of thing. Right? So this is my project. This is my assignment. And like all good college students, I waited until like the day or two before it was done before I started my first attempt. And there was this hill that went down from our school all the way down to this kind of like mini restaurant shopping area where there was like a McDonald's and a Tim Hortons and a Zellers and these different kinds of stores that you could go in and get things done. And I remember it's like a half a mile walk down this hill. And so I'm walking down this hill and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go find somebody at McDonald's to share my faith in Jesus with, right? And so I'm walking down this hill and I'm praying the whole way. God, just anoint like this conversation that I'm going to have right now. I pray that there's going to be somebody there, and as I walk down and I go to McDonald's, it's going to be obvious that they're ready to hear the gospel, and they'll just accept you as their Lord and Savior. And God, I pray that you would just work in this situation. I'm going on and on and on and praying down this hill the whole way like I've never prayed before as I walk into McDonald's. And finally, I get to McDonald's, and I open the door, and behold, there was a gentleman in the back corner with a newspaper. And I'm like, thank you, Jesus. This is it. This is the man. And so I walk into this back corner, and I'm prayed up, and I'm ready to share the gospel with this guy. And I look up, and I just say, hey, sir, do you mind if I sit down? And he looks up at me, and he says, yes. Yes, I do mind if you sit down. At which point, I hadn't planned for that. And so I panicked. And the next words out of my mouth were, okay. And I turned and walked away and sat down in, I don't know, just sadness, right? I'm a loser. I failed. I didn't get it. I didn't do it right. And you know, when we go into these conversations like that, right? Who wants to have a conversation? Who wants to subject themselves to that? Who wants to feel rejected, right? Who wants to do that? And so here's the insight based on that experience that connects with our passage that I want us to take away. You see, unlike Jesus, I had to go to McDonald's. I didn't want to go to McDonald's. I had to go to McDonald's. Because if I didn't, I was going to get a bad grade. I was going to get a bad mark. I was going to fail the class. And my friends, that's the wrong approach. That's the wrong motive. If we approach sharing our faith with people from that perspective, sharing our faith is something we have to do because we're a follower of Jesus, because the Bible says so, because that's what the pastor says, or that's what it means to be a good Christian, I'm afraid we're missing it, right? We're looking at it like an assignment or a project, and people are smart. They're going to see right through that. We have to want to start the conversation, and that only comes from a heart of love. Love for God and love for people. That has to be our motive. A heart that says, I genuinely care about people, regardless of race, regardless of background, regardless of orientation, or regardless of history. Because Jesus loves and cares about people regardless of race, regardless of background, regardless of orientation, regardless of history. Wanting to start the conversation has to and must come from a heart of love. So how do we get there? Well, let me tell you how I got there. The assignment thing didn't work out so well. And so I had to get down on my knees and I had to say, God, would you break my heart for people? Would you teach me how to love people like you love people and not see them as people that need to be fixed? Not see them as, this is my project. But God, help me to love them like you love them. Help me to desire to know them like you know them. Would you break my heart? And so maybe there's some of us here today where we're trying to have conversations because we're supposed to have conversations, right? And my challenge would be, you know what? Would we be willing to pray a prayer and ask God to help us to change our motive, to break our heart for people, to break our heart for our classmates, to break our heart for our friends, our family members, our neighbors, and our coworkers? Because, my friends, to start the conversation, you have to want to start the conversation, and that only happens with heart transformation. Now, there are some other things that we notice in this conversation Jesus is having that are recorded in John 4, and the next being who Jesus is talking to, right? And if you remember from the text, it's a Samaritan woman and Jesus is alone, right? Because it's lunchtime, and his disciples are off trying to find a Chick-fil-A so that they can eat. And we learn that according to verse 8. Now, two things to point out here. First, Jewish men rarely speak to women in public, right? They don't even speak to their wives in public. That's just the culture that they're in, all right? So that isn't normal. Secondly, single men wouldn't even think about it, let alone interact with them. So Jesus is definitely going outside the social norms on this one. But then on top of that, it's noon, right? Which wasn't a normal time to draw water. It's the heat of the day. Normally when people came to draw water, it would be in the morning, and it would be kind of a social thing, and they would do it when it was cool in the morning or cool at the end of the day. They wouldn't come in the blaring sun in the heat of the day, right? And yet this woman who is a Samaritan does, indicating that maybe she's trying to isolate herself. Maybe she's trying to not be around people because she's a social deviant. There's something wrong about her life. She's an outcast. People don't really accept her because of something in her life. And we learn about that a little bit later on when Jesus kind of shares with her, hey, would you go get your husband? And she says, I don't have a husband. He says, I know. In fact, you've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're with now isn't your husband. And she's kind of floored by that, because all of a sudden we're learning why she isn't accepted by her people. And it's because she's got this lifestyle that in that context is seen as immoral, as wrong. She's promiscuous, right? And yet Jesus had to go through Samaria. He had to talk with this woman who was kind of an outcast from her society. And to do that, he had to be willing to break the social norms. My friends, can you see how this might be a little awkward for Jesus, or maybe a little awkward for us, a little uncomfortable? In fact, if you look at the disciples' reaction in verse 27, when they return from buying food, they're a little bit surprised, right? Peter and Andrew are walking together, and they're like, who's down there with Jesus? Pete, who is that? A woman? Seriously, is Jesus talking to a woman right now? Doesn't he know that's not okay? That's weird. Philip, hey, Philip, come over here, look at this. Is that Jesus? Maybe you should ask him. Maybe he doesn't know, Philip. We should let him in on that, right? Or look at verse 9, right? And even the woman is surprised at Jesus' actions here, right? When Jesus says, hey, can I have a drink? She says in verse 9, she responds, how can you ask me for a drink? Our people don't even get along. Do you know who you're talking to? Do you know who I am? Jesus, you shouldn't be talking to me, right? If you knew me, you'd be like, whoa, I'm not talking to her. And yet Jesus had to go through the Samaria. The point being, like we see in the text, sometimes we're intimidated to talk to people who aren't like us, who are different than us. In fact, most times we have a tendency to cluster with people who are most like us. Am I right? We have a tendency to cluster with people who are like us, who believe like us, who think like us, who act like us. And it's in those circles that we have spiritual conversations, right? That make us feel good. But it's often not in those circles that we need to be having conversations. It's often outside those circles. It's the other circles of people where we are a little bit uncertain of how they're going to respond, like we see happening in this passage. You see, in order to start a conversation, number one, you have to want to start the conversation. But number two, you have to be willing to go and meet people where they're at. Just like Jesus was willing to go and meet this Samaritan woman. A couple of years ago, I was sitting in my office on a Friday morning, and several of the other pastors, it was either their day off or they were on vacation or they were gone. Bottom line, I was the only pastor in the office, and there was our office administrator who was down the hall and around the corner, and I'm in there working in my office, and I get this phone call. And she says to me, Pastor Tim, there's somebody here who wants to know if he can meet with you. And I'm like, sweet, I love people. I'll go meet with this guy. Right? And so I walk down the hall and I go down to her office, and there's a guy standing there, and he looks a little different, right? I got my work clothes on, and I'm in my work clothes aren't like some of y'all's work clothes, right? I got nice pants on, a nice shirt on, I'm all dressed up, right? And so I walk out there, and there's this guy standing there, and he looks like he's been run through the ringer. I mean, his hair's all messed up, and he's not clean shaven, and he doesn't look like me, right? He smells funny. I don't know if he's bathed, and I'm just like, hey dude, what's up? And like we go off into this little side room, and he starts talking to me, and he says, you're the third church I've called this morning. The other two churches, nobody was available or willing to talk to me. He's like, I need to talk to somebody. And I was like, okay, what's going on? And he says, I think I saw a demon. Right now, some of us, if that's the opening line to the conversation, we're leaving, okay? Right? This guy's woohoo, But that's what he says to me. He's like, I think I saw a demon. And I was like, oh yeah, well, why don't you tell me about that? And so he goes on to tell me about how he and some friends were doing some drugs or something like that. There weren't things that keep on the down low that you're not supposed to be doing, right? They're doing that, and they bust out this Ouija board, and they start like playing around with this, just having fun, innocent fun, when all of a sudden, like somebody goes down on the ground, and they're just like talking like all crazy talk, and things are getting weird, and he's just like scared out of his mind about all this stuff that's going on. He's like, yeah, I know I wasn't kind of in my right frame of mind, but I swear all this stuff was happening, and it just scared me, and I couldn't sleep all night. What do you think about that? And, of course, I wasn't there, so I didn't be like, no, you didn't really see anything. I thought, dude, you know what I think? You came here this morning for a reason, because you realize that all of a sudden the spiritual world is real. And if that side of things is real, then maybe the other side of things is real too. And maybe, just maybe, God is trying to get a hold of your life. Do you think that might be? And he said, yeah. So I asked him about his relationship with the Lord and where he was at on his journey, and there wasn't much there. And for the next 20, 30 minutes, we talked. And I was able to lead him to know Christ right there at that little table. And that was awesome. But then the even awesomer part was that the following week, he brought his friend and his girlfriend with him, and I was able to share with them and pray with them on top of it all, right? And it was all because our church was willing to meet with somebody who looked a little different, who wasn't like us, who was outside our normal circle. And we were willing to meet him where he was at. My friends, we need to start having conversations outside of our normal circle of relationships, right? We need to meet people where they are at and not judge them, but simply be willing to start a conversation. And don't hear what I'm not saying, okay? I'm not saying abandon all the relationships that you already have, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to make more room in our lives to have more conversations with people who are not like us. That's what we need to do, who don't believe the way we do. Because if we are going to meet with people like us, people in our comfort zones all the time, if we're only going to meet with people where we're at, then we're going to limit the capacity in which God wants to use us. And so the challenge becomes for us Who are those people in our life who are not like us? Who God is breaking our hearts for? Who we need to begin having conversations with? Or where are the places that we need to go through where there's darkness and people need the light of Jesus in their life, and it's up to us to bring it to them? Do you have some friends who aren't like you? If not, you may need to find some. You may need to develop some. You may need to start a conversation to expand your relational circle. So just in review, tips this far for the SALT method. To start a conversation, we have to want to start the conversation. Okay? Secondly, we have to be willing to go and meet people where they're at, to get out of our comfort zone, to get out of our little circles of people that are like us. And then finally, and I love this third point, to start a conversation, we have to have the mindset of just getting on base. And let me explain that to you. Notice in the text we're reading, Jesus simply starts with a question. And the question unfolds naturally from there. He says, "Will you give me a drink?" That's not weird. That's not awkward. I mean, even we say that when we walk into a restaurant and there's people around us. "Hey, would you like a drink?" "Excuse me, ma'am, could you get me a drink?" "Excuse me, sir, I'd like to order a," getting a drink is not a weird way to start a conversation, right? Notice, he doesn't start the conversation, "Hey, do you know where you're going to go when you die?" He doesn't start the conversation that way, right? He doesn't start the conversation, "What do you think about life after death?" He doesn't do that. No, he starts on the other end of the pool, on the shallow end, with a very simple, ordinary question, right? "Will you give me a drink?" That's not weird, okay? Now, obviously, the purpose is to get to deeper things. That's his purpose. But he doesn't start there. And I think for us, that's such a struggle when it comes to sharing our faith, right? We want to get to deeper things right away. You see, for so many of us, we approach sharing our faith with the mindset of hitting a home run right up to bat, right? We expect to be praying and walk down to McDonald's and behold, there's somebody who needs Jesus. And we walk right in and pray the sinner's prayer with them. And yay! That's how we approach it, right? But if that's our mindset, then more often than not, we're going to be disappointed. Because statistically speaking, as reported by an article on sharing Jesus without fear, most adults who come to faith in Jesus only do so after 7 times of hearing the gospel, right? 7 times. That means 6 of those times they rejected the invitation that was given to them. So don't go into showing your faith, sharing your faith with somebody with the mindset that someone's going to respond every time. Because they're not. Going with the mindset of just getting them a little bit closer to Jesus. Just getting them on base. 1 step closer than what they were before. Now, if somebody's ready to accept Jesus Christ, don't be like, "Hang on, you missed a base," right? Don't do that, all right? Help them find that relationship with Jesus, right? But maybe we should look at it as, how do I help this person take a next step, right? For instance, maybe someone only has a negative experience with followers of Jesus, right? And so you start hanging out with that person because you love them, you care about them, they're your friend, and you're hanging out with them, and then one day they find out, "Oh, you follow Jesus? You're not weird. You're actually kind of fun. You're not judgmental like everybody else. And you follow Jesus? Are you sure you follow Jesus?" Right? And maybe we just give them a positive experience with somebody who follows Jesus because they see Jesus in you. Right? Or maybe, right, they've never even thought about the existence of God before. It's not even on their spectrum. It's not even on their plane. They don't even think about it. And they're hanging out with you for after a while, and then something goes wrong in their life, and they're sharing with you about what's going on in their life, and you just simply say, "Hey, I know you're struggling with that. Would it be okay if I pray with you?" And they're like, "You're a Christian?" Right? And it just all of a sudden brings them an awareness that maybe there's something else in this life besides what I see in front of me, besides what's going on right here and now. Yeah, you can pray for me, right? And that begins a conversation. Those would be awesome examples of helping people get on base, all right? But here's the key. After you help someone get on base, the challenge is to keep the conversation going. To keep the conversation, don't just let it stay shallow forever. But using wisdom and discernment and praying, be looking at how to take them a step further. Several years ago, I was on an airplane traveling to Canada. And I love riding on airplanes because you get to sit next to people and they can't leave. All right? And so I'm sitting next to this girl, and she was from the Netherlands. And I'm flying on my way back to school, and she's reading a book. And so I say, hey, what are you reading? And she starts to tell me about this book. I'm like, oh, that's cool. So where are you going today? And then she proceeds to tell me she's going to the Netherlands. Oh, really? You're from the Netherlands. That's cool. What do you like about the Netherlands? She goes on to share. We're talking, and, it's like 20, 30 minutes. And finally, she says to me, so what are you doing? Well, I'm on my way back to college. Oh, where do you go to college? Bethany Bible College. I'm studying to be a pastor. You're studying to be a pastor? What made you want to be a pastor? Open door, right? And now I begin to share about how God has been working in my life. Now, did I lead her to Jesus Christ? Did we sit down, did we kneel down at our seats while the unbuckle seatbelt sign was on and be like, lead her to Christ? No, I didn't. I just gave her a positive experience of somebody who follows Jesus and shared my life story with her, right? And then maybe on our next flight, or a year from then, or 2 years from then, or a week from then, somebody else has an opportunity to follow up. I love that. And that's what we see happening in John 4, right? And then I like those conversations, those kind of one-step, one-shot conversations. Those are great, but then what's even better is when you build a relationship with someone that you can keep that conversation going. Like when I went to Great Clips 2 weeks ago to get my hair cut, right? And I met a hairstylist, and I love getting my hair cut because guess what? They can't leave, right? And so you begin talking, and you begin asking questions, right? Hey, how long have you been in this county? Where do you live? Tell me about your family. Oh, that's so cool. I just moved here. You just moved here? Yeah, I did. Well, what do you do? Well, I'm a pastor over at Welcome Wesleyan. Do you know where that is? No. Where's Welcome Wesleyan? Oh, it's over at 1040 Ebenezer. You know where that is? Yeah, I think I know that area. So what made you become a pastor? Oh, Open Door. Let me tell you, right? And I begin to share about how God is working and what he's doing in my life. Now, did we stop right there and have prayer and she all of a sudden decided to give her life to Jesus? No, I don't even know where she's at on her faith journey. But maybe I'll find out the next time I go get my hair cut. You see how that works? And this is what we see Jesus doing in this passage. He makes some conversation by asking a question, gives this woman something to think about, and then keeps the conversation going. In fact, we learn that after she leaves Jesus, she goes and she tells other people about him because she was kind of in awe of his responses. And then Jesus keeps the conversation going for 2 more days, and many come to believe in him. Now, does that mean after 2 days, the people we have conversations with are going to decide to follow Jesus? Probably not. I hope so, right? How about 2 weeks? How about 2 months? How about 2 years? How about 20 years? I don't know. But if we can keep a mindset of getting on base and letting God do the work rather than us trying to hit a home run every time, I believe we'll be much more effective in helping people to know, love, and follow Jesus. In fact, my desire out of this whole conversation is that we would walk away after these next few weeks with the mindset of, I can do this. This doesn't sound as hard as I'm making it out to be. I can have a conversation with somebody, right? I can do this. I can have a spiritual conversation with my coworker. I can have a spiritual conversation with my classmate and make myself available to respond. My friends, we need to be expanding our circles. We need to be asking God to break our hearts. And we need to be willing to begin these conversations and just help somebody take a next step. Just help them get on base. And we're going to see how God is going to move. We're going to see what he's going to do in not only my life, in your life, but the people's lives around us. Because there's going to be a light that's going to come in and it's going to shatter the darkness around us, because that's what God has called us to do. And that's what he's come to be in my life and in yours. And I can't wait to see it happen, because I believe it's going to happen.